Welcome to our third video in the Boost Your Rehab series. Today we're going to talk about finding the right dose. Of course, we are continuing our cup analogy. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, make sure to give the first two videos a watch. Specifically in the last video, we were talking about building a bigger cup, and we were going to do this by actually applying more stress to the system. And because our bodies are anti-fragile, we will probably grow back stronger. But only if we put the right amount of stress on the system that matches our factors for recovery, like time, sleep, stress, and nutrition. If we mismatch that stress exposure, we might end up with blisters. In other words, our cup might overflow again. So how are we actually going to tackle this? How are we going to determine the right amount of stress to put on our system? In order to understand that, we need to have a closer look at stress exposure in general. So last video focused mainly on the size of the cup. Today we're going to try and quantify stress exposure by looking at what's actually in our cup. We're focusing on the water today. So in the first video, I already told you guys that stress exposure is made up of three components. So the things that you do in a gym with us at Boost, then you might also have some physical demands of the sports that you do or any other recreational activities that you do. And then you also have some physical demands of your day-to-day life, like walking towards work, walking up and down the stairs, taking the bike, etc., etc. So these things combined make up your total stress exposure. But the most important thing that I want to teach you today is that we're not focusing on what we are doing. We are focusing on how much of that activity we are doing. So it's a bit like saying that we don't want to focus on the type of music that you're listening to. We want to focus on how loud you are playing that music. And of course there is some nuance to this, because I understand that on the same volume setting, playing heavy metal or hard rock is an entirely different experience than playing classical music. Likewise, some activities are more physical demanding than the other ones. I understand that. But for the sake of simplicity, we are going to focus on movement quantity, how much we're doing, instead of movement quality. And that movement quantity over all these three domains, so what you do at Boost, what you do in your own sports, and what you do in your daily life, that makes up our total stress exposure. So we have quite some components here. And I keep saying how much you're doing, but how am I actually going to determine how much I'm doing? So what am I actually talking about here? What is movement quantity? So we have three factors that mainly influence this. That will be intensity. So that is in the weight room, how much weight I'm using, or when I'm running, that translates to how fast I'm actually running. Then we have volume, and that is how much I'm doing. So how many sets am I doing in a gym, or how long am I running? And frequency is how often I'm doing things. So am I working out twice a week? Am I doing this 5 times a week, etc.? The combination of intensity, volume, and frequency make up our stress exposure. So we want to look at what we're doing at Boost, what we're doing in our sports, and what we're doing at our daily life through the lens of intensity, volume, and frequency. And the combination of these things make up our total stress exposure. But to complicate this even more, all these things are relative. We can't just say 100 kilo is high intensity, because 100 kilos for the person on the left might be quite a high intensity, while 100 kilos for the person on the right might be a pretty low intensity. So all these things are relative. So here we have a visual representation of volume. If you bend your back for plucking a flower, it's a low volume. But if you bend your back for 4 hours straight to do some gardening, then that is a pretty high volume compared to what we see on the left. But again here, 4 hours of gardening is also relative, because if you haven't been doing any gardening for the entire year and all of a sudden you decide to do this and you spend with your back bent for 4 hours straight, that might give you some reaction because that volume is relatively high for you. So the stress exposure is going to be pretty high. In the other case, so here on the right, we have a person doing this professionally. He might do this 8 hours straight every day of the week. Now, 4 hours of gardening for the person on the right here is a relatively low volume. So again, if we're talking about intensity, if we're talking about volume, also with frequency, we want to look at these things relatively to what you are used to, relatively to what your body is capable of. So, just to recap here, we have this stress exposure thing, and we're looking at what we do at Boost, what we do in our own sports, and what we do in our day-to-day life. We are looking at how much we are doing by intensity, volume, and frequency. All these things are relative. So you now have some understanding of how much there is actually in your cup. And now when you're adding activity, we want to keep these things in mind. So we want to start off with an amount of intensity, an amount of volume, an amount of frequency that matches our recovery capacities. So I hope you have a grasp of that idea, but how are we going to translate that to actual practical use? So I have 3 tips for you to make this a bit more practical. So one is just start slow. It's pretty hard to make an educated guess here. So if you're not really sure, just start on the lower end and from there on progress. You can progress by making it heavier, doing it more often, doing a more difficult version of the task, doing it faster, take away some stability. So just start somewhere and start progressing from there. It's better to take more small steps than take one big leap and increase your chances of falling all the way down and starting over again. So with all these things said, we can make an educated guess, but this will still be pretty hard. So I recommend you to start on the lower end and start easy and start slow. From there on, it will be a bit of a trial and error thing here. So I also want to teach you this traffic light system to evaluate and communicate to your trainer and listen to your body. So let's say you worked out with me and the next day you might have some increase in pain, but now you also have a bit of a loss of function. That means that the things that you could do before the session, you're now unable to do. So this is a loss of function. And most important here is that you haven't recovered of the session before the next session. So these things happen. This is okay. There's no need for drama. However, this might be a good indicator for dialing back just ever so slightly. So this is our red light. It was a bit too much and we're dialing back to see how your body reacts to that. Now yellow here is just on the edge. So you might have some increase in pain, but you have no loss of function. Most importantly, you have recovered just in time before the next session starts. Now this is all okay, so we applied a proper amount of stress to the system and your body is clearly able to recover from this. However, we are giving it a hard time here. We are really challenging it. So it is good, but not really a foundation for putting even more stress on the system. So we want to stay here and not increase the stress. Now, if the traffic light is green, that means You might be a bit sore the day after or even have an increase of pain, which is okay, but you still have no loss of function and you have recovered quite well before we have our next session or your next activity. So here is our sweet spot. We can now increase our stress and actually take those small steps towards our goal. So the third tool that I want to hand to you, that I want to teach you, is I want you to understand, we talked about this already, that you're not going into every session with the same cup, because we have those daily fluctuators that we talked about. So one day you might come in very stressed. You might have had a very stressful day at work. Or another day you might have had a very bad night of sleep. So these things can happen and influence the size of your cup on that day. Also, there might have also been some activity before your session, so your cup might also be a bit full. I want you to go into every session having a clear look at what is my cup at this moment? How much stress am I going to apply today? Because these things are not linear. Yes, so I gave you 3 tools here. One tip was start off slow and progress slow. Tip 2 was always have feedback. Always, when you apply stress to the system, listen to your body, see how it reacts, evaluate and communicate. But this one is feed forward, so always come into a session explaining to your trainer what your situation is, being honest to yourself, what can I handle today? This all will cause it to be quite a bumpy ride. This won't be a straight line towards recovery. You might have some ups, you might have some downs, you might have some sprints, and there might be some times that you need to take a step back. This is all okay and part of the plan.